she's not on the list. So if you say Mona Lisa, you're going to be wrong, because I'm not going to show you the Mona Lisa. But that goes back to my answer about Botticelli, right? If you're in the ballpark, you're good. At the same time, the whole point of providing a slide list and going through the trouble to make one up and give it to you is that it does give me a standard to judge people from. But you'll notice when you look back at the slide list that all of them are local works of art, which is something I said at the beginning. We're really going to try and focus on works of art that are, I shouldn't teach this class the same way I would if I lived back in Oregon, because we've got such a great collection here to work from. So we're spending quite a bit of time learning about works of art from the DC metro region, right? And the midterm is, how did I pare it down to 30 out of all the things we've looked at? We sometimes look at 30 in a day, you know? How did I pare it down to 30? Well, I decided let's just do local works of art, right? Okay, so we left off, over here, talking about Raphael, right? We got to Raphael, and we mentioned the fact that he came, now we're still high Renaissance, so we're that full fruition of the ideas of harmony, balance, proportion that came out of the Renaissance. We've seen artists interested in realism, in ancient Roman body types, and even interested in ancient Roman subject matter. And we've certainly still seeing much of that, although our Madonna and Child is obviously not a Roman body type or even a Roman, well, kind of. The proportions are based on ancient Roman art, but certainly not a Roman subject matter. Raphael comes to Florence in 1503-ish, 1504, actually 1505, end of 1505. And when he gets there, Leonardo's there. Michelangelo has just left. They might have overlapped by about a month is all, but Michelangelo's gone to Rome to work for the Pope. And there's now an online section there to talk about Michelangelo working for the Pope, the Sistine ceiling and whatnot. So when Raphael gets to Florence, the primary established artist there, the most important established artist in Florence, is Leonardo. And when he gets there, Leonardo is, for him, the biggest influence while he's in Florence. And this is what we left talking about, the sort of swirly nature of the bit of robe that comes around her bodice on Raphael's Madonna and Child. We can see certain similarities to the way that Leonardo does these folds that seem to swirl in nature. At the same time, Raphael, like most artists who are influenced by Leonardo, he cleans it up. It's never mysterious like Leonardo is. Nobody is but Leonardo, really. Mysterious like that. So the landscape doesn't have any sfumato. There's a little bit of atmospheric perspective, so the hills look, hazy in the distance, but it's not smoky. And Raphael is not trying to blur things together. He's not trying to hide things in the shadows. In fact, there aren't really any shadows, Everything's so brightly lit and the colors are nice and perky and bright. A lot of people don't like Raphael for this. He's sort of like Leonardo light, light art from Raphael. And, but I quite think this really is a gorgeous picture, right? But there's none of that strangeness that makes Leonardo so popular, really, with everybody, myself included, is that strangeness, the conception of the landscape as being liquid and forms as being liquid. It's really played down with Raphael, right? Well, he also gets a call from Pope Julius, and in 1508, the Pope calls Raphael to Rome as well, because the Pope is trying to assemble in Rome all of the greatest artistic talent in Italy. He wants everybody working for him because Julius is going to rebuild Rome bottom to top and leave a lasting legacy of his artistic patronage, of his presence in Rome. He really wants Rome to resound with his legacy, right? And so he's already got Michelangelo there doing the Sistine ceiling. He wants Raphael to come and do some more frescoes. And there's probably a good reason for this. One, Michelangelo hated painting. He hated it. He really didn't. He wanted to sculpt. Right? So he didn't want to be doing these paintings. He's probably grousing up a storm because he's really irascible and kind of cantankerous. Right? Difficult to get along with. And so Julius has got other painting projects that he wants done, and he realized he doesn't want to fight with Michelangelo all the time. Right? So Raphael's coming for that. But over and above that, even if you're a Michelangelo, Julius has got more projects than he's got artists. So he needs a Raphael as well. And the thing he gives Raphael to do is a sequence of 4 rooms that were the Pope's private apartments. These were his private studies of sorts, right? And originally they were filled with furniture. Now they're filled with tourists, right? And this one, the Stanza della Segnatura, is the most famous of the 4, the Room of the Signatures. And this is also covered in an online section because this is a really important work of art, right? Raphael does all 4 walls in this one, plus 3 more rooms, right? He never finishes. He dies. He dies at 37. He's very, very young. Raphael does, right? It's called the Room of the Signatures because this is where the Pope signed official documents. The Room of the Signatures, right? And because that was the primary use of the room also housed his private library. The books that he would need to consult in order to sign these documents. And Raphael's wall paintings are all about the subject matter that he studied. So the famous School of Athens on the right is philosophy. The one on the left is poetry, right? There's another one on, you might guess it, theology. And another one on law, right? These are the themes for the library, right? So he embodies thought, wisdom, learning in the paintings on the walls. And this is discussed in greater detail in the online section I put up this afternoon, right? While he's in Rome, Raphael continues to paint these images of the Virgin and Child. We talked about the fact that while he was in Florence, he painted a couple dozen of these that still survive, was carving himself a corner of the market in Florence with these images. He continues to do these images while in Rome. So in addition to working for the Pope on these bigger projects, he's got some side work as well, right? And making smaller, although this is pretty big, right? It's about 3 feet across. It's a pretty big picture, 4 feet across. Where again, he's still sort of pounding through these images of the Madonna and Child for the open market. And like I said, we've got the best Raphael collection outside of Rome, really, pretty much anywhere outside of Rome is here in DC. And how we got it when the museum only opened in the late 30s is incredible, right? The Metropolitan New York, the best museum in America, would give up their Raphael for any one of the ones that we have, because theirs sucks. Like, it's really an off day for Raphael, right? So we're very lucky here. And many of them are named for later owners. So the Cowper family owned 2 of these. One was bigger than the other, right? So this is the small Cowper Madonna, named after a later owner. This is the Alba Madonna, named after a later owner, right? And after having moved to Rome, so this is done after he's moved on. One of the things we see with Raphael's art, after having moved to Rome, is that instead of being influenced by Leonardo, he becomes influenced by the heavy hitter in Rome, who is Michelangelo, right? He's followed him there. And once he gets to Rome, his works start to look more and more like Michelangelo's. And this is particularly evident if we look at the figure of the Madonna. You'll notice that she's this wonderful sort of pyramid, right? This big, massive pyramid form that sort of dominates the landscape behind her. She rises higher than the distant hills, and there's not much around her to sort of set her off. She's seated right on the ground. She's leaning on a stump. This is a way of her showing, of Raphael showing her humility, but also in many ways connecting her to the earth itself, maybe to the Roman goddess of the earth, right? But the size of the figure, the massiveness, the monumentality of the figure comes from having looked at what Michelangelo was doing while he was in Rome. So if we look, for example, at the leg in the foreground, look at how big her, and I don't mean fat, I just mean they're muscular, right? Look at her legs. Look at how big she is, sort of down here. She's really strong and sturdy, right? And even the hand that's in the book has a certain sort of muscularity to the fingers compared to the Cowper Madonna, which is a little more dainty, right? This all comes from the fact that once Raphael got to Rome, he started looking at works by Michelangelo, right? I brought one in from the Sistine ceiling, so you can see it. There's one of Michelangelo's, one of his prophets who foretold Christ's coming from the Sistine ceiling, and she has that same sort of burliness. In fact, Michelangelo's even more so. I don't think Raphael could ever bring himself to make his women look like bodybuilding Russians, men with breasts, right? But that's what Michelangelo's look like. They're just these monsters, right? Look at that arm. God, I'm a guy and I'm never going to have arms like that. It's just a monster of a figure. But look at how stable and monumental Michelangelo's figures is. And look over at Raphael, and this is exactly where he's getting it from, right? Again, you wouldn't mistake it because it doesn't have some of the qualities that make Michelangelo look like Michelangelo. But he's picking up on certain things, right? Now, in the Alba Madonna, we have the Virgin Mary, and we could certainly, if you came up on an exam, you could talk about the colors that she's wearing and the fact that we've seen those again and again and again, and that each of the colors has a particular symbolism, right? The blue we've talked about, the red we've talked about, the white underneath the red we've also talked about. Colors that come with symbolisms, right? The blue of faithfulness, the red of suffering, the white of purity, right? These are all colors that are associated with the Virgin Mary in one way or the other. We've also seen in a great number of Annunciation scenes where she's interrupted while reading. And it looks as if, even though this is not an Annunciation scene, this Madonna is also in the middle of reading and has stopped doing that for a second. Why? Because she's distracted by the boys. Right? The kids need some attention. And so she's looking over quite lovingly at what they're doing. Now, who are the two kids? Jesus, that's a fair bet, right? Who's the other one then? Who said that? John the Baptist, right? He's Jesus' cousin, and he's about 6 months older than Christ. And he's going to die about 6 months before Christ as well. He's beheaded, right, by King Herod. Okay? So John the Baptist is the little boy kneeling on the ground. And we know this because he's wearing this fur coat. The Baptist, when he's an adult, takes on a fur coat worn wrong way around so that it's spiky and irritating, like a virgin wool shirt, right? Scratchy. And the reason he wears it is he doesn't want to be comfortable in his human existence. He wants to continue to think about, he doesn't want life to be pleasant. He wants life to be unpleasant because that keeps him thinking about the afterlife. And here we see him even as an infant still wearing it, just so we can recognize him. That's the only reason. And you'll notice that he's holding in his hands a cross that he's fashioned out of some sticks, right? And Jesus is grabbing it. This is the central meaning of this image, is that Christ is reaching out to take the cross. Think about what that means, right? He's accepting his fate. Even though it's just a little toy cross, a little symbol that John the Baptist has made, Christ is accepting of it. And as he reaches for it, you see what he's got to do? He's coming out of the Virgin Mary's lap. He's about to sort of step out on his own, rising up from her protection, from her womb, in a way, to take his fate, even as a child. Now, theologically, Christians would argue that he knew, even as a child, his entire fate. Right? And you'll notice that both the Virgin Mary and Christ is looking at the Baptist, he's looking at his cousin, but the Virgin Mary is looking at the cross. And the look on her face is not one of a mother who sees the implement that will kill her child, even though she knows that. What she sees instead is, within herself, she has to support this. Her primary job, now that Christ is born, is to be faithful to his mission, however much pain it may cause her. Right? So she looks rather pleasantly, doesn't she, as Christ reaches out to grab that cross from the infant Baptist, right? And seems to be willing to accept this fate that goes with the color that she's wearing. She's sublimating the pain, right? She's burying it within her. Emma.
Does she not get a halo in this movie?
That's a good question. And in fact, Jesus has got just a hint of one right here.
So does John.
I think that's, you see, it's hard to see,
Yeah,
but I think that the halos have gone a long way from those golden pipelines, right, that we saw even into the 15th century and beyond. And when we get to the High Renaissance, and I think there's an interesting side note here, because part of what we see when we get to the High Renaissance is they're so interested in getting the humanity of this, right, that they don't want these distracting, gilded bits, right? That's right. And also, where do you, when we think about even in international Gothic works, where there were these golden backgrounds that were gold leaf laid on the panel, right? There's something so artificial about that when you see it. I think they're gorgeous, right? And I think anybody that's bought them thinks they're gorgeous in the 14th century. But they really undermine the sense of reality. And as does a golden pipelet, right? And by simply giving us the trace outline of them, Raphael is able to focus more on the human figures. I remember that Leonardo, he didn't even like him at all, right? So when we saw the Last Supper, right, nobody had halos there. And in fact, when we see copies of Leonardo, and there's lots of copies out there of the Last Supper, people almost are always sticking halos where they belong, but where he left them out. Right? So what I think happens is that by omitting the halos, we end up reading it subtly and in sort of two different ways, right? As the holy figures, but also as a mother, right, who has to accept the fate of her son. She can't intervene, right? Because she's been chosen by God to do this, and this is part of what that's all about, right? Now, Raphael also chooses all the landscape elements to add to the meaning as well. In particular, the flowers in the foreground, all of which relate to the character of the Virgin Mary. And I don't really have time to go into them one by one by one. But each of those flowers are, in fact, symbolic of a different aspect of the Virgin Mary's character, right? So Raphael also goes to Rome. And what we see in the High Renaissance with both Raphael and Michelangelo is a shift in focus away from Florence, although there's still artists working there, and Rome becoming a major center for art production. And the reason it wasn't before was simply because of the papal schism, right? The papal exile. And it wasn't until the middle of the 15th century, in the middle of the 1400s, that the popes came back to Rome and started buying art again. Right? Now, before we leave the High Renaissance, we're going to look at one other artistic center that we haven't really discussed very much yet. And that's the city of Venice, which is to the north and right on the ocean. You guys have all heard of Venice before, yes? Canals, it's a lagoon, right? It was built on a series of islands that have been buttressed up with piers, right? There are very, very few streets. There are no cars. Not that there were in the Renaissance, but, there are no horse-drawn buggies. There are boats, right? It's a city on the water. And it has quite a few things that set it apart from other Renaissance centers as well. Venice wasn't founded as a city until the 7th century, the 600s AD. Right? That means that Venice has no Roman heritage. It was founded after the fall of the Roman Empire by a great number of centuries. It was founded in the Middle Ages. So the Renaissance is going to look different there because they're not going to be looking back at Roman statues in the contrapposto pose or Roman frescoes and their naturalism. It's going to be different. And in fact, as we look at it, we do in fact find it's different. What they do look back at from ancient Rome is poetry. And there's a whole group of writers in Venice who are writing modern versions of Roman poems. And the kind that appeals to them the most are what are called Arcadian poems. Now, what's an Arcadian poem?
Are these what the painting is based off of?
Kind of. They're related to them, totally related to them, right? Yeah, that's the reason for talking about all this, is the paintings will tie into this. An Arcadian poem is a poem that focuses on a region called Arcadia. And in ancient Roman poetry, Arcadia was a landscape that was, how to put this right, frozen in time in a good way, where progress never really happened, where people never grow old.
So this isn't a real place?
It's not a real place. It's a mythological place, Arcadia. It's where satyrs live, you know? It's an idealized world coming out of, again, Roman mythology, right? Where time has stood still, where progress hasn't happened, where people live a more perfect existence in a golden age, right? Where everything is shepherds in tune with their surroundings. That's in fact one of the primary themes of Arcadian poetry, is how great it is to live the life of a shepherd. Must seem pretty good to you right now. They don't have to take tests with slide lists, you know? Midterms don't exist. What do? They get up in the morning, they go out with their flock, they come home at night, and they're done, right? They're in harmony with nature, right? Shepherd's life. And if you think, I'll get you in a second, Peyton. If you think about it in general, right? There's this, why do we go camping? It's fun. Why is it fun? It's fun to throw a tent and have natural light, you know? Get away from your stupid cell phone. I was watching this thing. There was this commercial probably for Verizon, where these two guys are putting their mountain bikes on top of their car, right? And he's got no gas. It's Geico. It's a Geico commercial. He's got no gas. He gets his cell phone out and he taps out of gas, and a vehicle shows up and gives him gas and drives. So I thought to myself, they don't have cell phone service out there. They're out in like Utah somewhere mountain biking, because there's nothing anywhere near them. Why do they have cell phone service? And I thought to myself, wouldn't that be the greatest cell phone ad? The Verizon guy comes in, look, you got service everywhere. He goes, yeah, but look, I don't. Nobody knows where I am. Isn't that great? Right? I'm off the grid for a bit. Why do we go camping, right? Because we want to be off the grid for a bit, because there's something kind of wonderful about getting back in touch, right, with ourselves as people, Because when you live in an urban environment, this becomes even more, right? If we lived in Moab, Utah, it wouldn't be a big deal, right? But we don't. We live in a densely urban area. right? Or close to a densely urban area, right? Yes, there are deer across the street on 26, you know. They've come here as well? There's a whole family that lives down there. That's where I walk my dogs, and there's a whole family. Anyway, so we're close to a densely urban environment, right? It's strange here. But the bottom line is that when you live in an urban environment, that issue of being able to get out of it, whether in activity or through your entertainment, right? Reading in this particular case, becomes that much more important, right? So Arcadian literature is an old Roman theme that we see the Venetians reviving, right? And it's often called, sorry about that, it's often called pastoral poetry, right? I'm sorry about that, let's get one more. There we go, pastoral poetry. Because pastoral refers to shepherds, right? That's why we call pastors, they lead the flock. Now you had your hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to say, is another reason that they, idolize, not idolize, but, they want to be a shepherd and that's, the perfect life? Is it because God's, the shepherd and we're his lambs and he leads us?
I think that's part of it, the idea that, he is the good shepherd and we are his flock.
Yeah.
But also, if you think about it, there's another issue that kind of ties into that. Who are the first people to hear about the birth of Christ? The shepherds, right? They're chosen by God himself as being sort of ahead of the kings. It's kind of this nice other the other 90%, right? The other 99% message is that there's something special about that, right? Now, if we think about Venice as being this environment, it's gorgeous. If you've ever been, it's a gorgeous city, right? But it's really a city. And there's nowhere to go for a park. They don't exist, right? You go to the water and it stinks. It's stunk then, you know? It does. It stinks to high heaven. Go in April. Don't go in July, you know? It's because people throw their sewers and into those canals. It stinks. It's gross. I love Venice, but it's gross. And the food sucks. And anyway,
What's the good part about Venice then?
well, it's gorgeous. It's stunningly beautiful. And so, but you're locked, right? In Venice, unlike Florence, you're stuck, right? There's nowhere to go to sort of find a tree to sit under, right? Very, very few places. So for them, this idea of the land, which was part of the Venice, the city, controls a part of the land as well. That's part of their republic, right? And the idea of getting out there and finding something special and untouched and perfect and unindustrialized and underdeveloped was for the Venetians an incredibly strong attraction. And so when we look at Venetian art, Renaissance art, we find things that we don't find in Florence or Rome. And that, in particular here, an interest in landscape, an unspoiled landscape, inhabited by the shepherds, where time has stood still. And if you read Venetian Renaissance poetry, these pastoral poems, they talk about the charms of the babbling brook and watching the sunset and strolling by the side of the river, wandering through the woods. And these are exactly the things that we see in artists from Renaissance Venice. So it's quite a bit different thing than what we've seen elsewhere. So here we've got an adoration of the shepherds. So here they are. These are our first people that have heard the message, right? Almost up to them. The first people who have heard the message, they've come to worship Christ. They're kneeling down, and we see there they are, their ratty clothes, right, as they made their way here. But you'll notice that the landscape is populated by a great many more shepherds as well. That they're everywhere. You can see them right behind them. In fact, just off the man with the red sleeves, just off his hips, you can see some sheep back there too, right? And two more shepherds there looking up into the sky, right? And the more you look, the more you see other figures. This man in the hut, for example. Here, a couple figures by the shore there. Giorgione is inviting us to imagine ourselves in this landscape. And we know from X-ray that as he worked on it, right, he kept pushing this rock further over this direction, changing his mind in order to open up more and more of the landscape so we can see. Now, normally in a scene like this, front and center would be the Holy Family. The Virgin Mary, Joseph, Jesus. But he's also pushed them off to the side. So that the focal point, the center of the composition, the shepherds. This is a pastoral painting. Right? Extolling the virtues of the unspoiled environment in the landscape itself. I'm not quite sure what's inside that shed. Every time I go, I look again to see if I can figure out what's going on back in there, and I can't. But there's another guy, we don't know what he's doing. Giorgione doesn't tell us. He's just there. He's just in the landscape looking. And as we look at the landscape back, you'll notice that we are a long way from civilization. In fact, the buildings that are closest to us are in ruins. If you look at the top of this building here, you can see that it's destroyed. Broken rafters at the top. And we've come to a different place out here with the Holy Family, maybe a better place still. That the city itself is something that is problematic, it's difficult, right? But with this, you'll notice that the Giorgione is focused on the fall of light, much more so than what we've seen in other artists. You can pick out a particular time of day here, a particular weather pattern. It's hot, it's steamy, you know? And the light is falling from below on the horizon and striking the sides of these buildings. I think he's aware of light as a metaphor. I think he's definitely aware of that. In fact, you'll notice there's a little candle burning in an archway there in the detail that we can see. But you'll also notice that the two figures behind our main shepherds are looking up into the upper left corner of the picture. They're looking toward the source of light. And what they see up there, come on, is an angel bearing the message. Right? And when you see that, you realize that angel is one source of light in the picture, isn't it? It's illuminating the trees around him. And in fact, if we look in the foreground at the Holy Family with the two shepherds, there's a pool of light that's fallen on Christ from that angel. And the shepherds in the back have noticed it. But it's a different source of light than the light that falls on the buildings behind it. So what we have with this particular image is a similar metaphor that we saw with Jan van Eyck, that we saw in other pictures. The holy light being distinguished, differentiated from natural light. The holy light's falling on the Holy Family. The holy light's falling on Christ, coming from the angel. And there's natural light behind it. Both a torch in a window and the sun itself falling on the buildings. And one of these sources of light is stronger than the other. The holy light is stronger than the natural light. Right? So Giorgione is working on these themes, right, as he's developing this picture. Working with landscape as a way of enhancing the meaning of the piece. Now we're about 2 minutes over, so is your hand up, Hosna? Okay, very good. So we'll pick up with Giorgione, we'll wrap up Renaissance Venice and move on to Mannerism next on Thursday, and that will give us next Monday, to